Okay, so my name is Gage,
I'm Zach.
I'm Carly.
and our topic is consumer perspectives at farmers markets, which is a little bit different than what it said on the
Okay.
sign-up sheet there. Our topic sort of evolved a little bit as we went with it. So our guiding research question was, does food origin and direct acquisition influence consumer perceptions at farmers markets? And in that, direct acquisition is referring to purchasing directly from producers.
So the National Association of Farmers Market in the UK defined farmers markets as a place where farmers, growers, or producers from a defined local area are present in person to sell their own produce directly to the public, and all products sold should be grown, reared, caught, baked, or processed somehow by the stallholder. And so generally when people think of farmers markets, they think of fresh, local, and organic produce grown by a small farmer. And people are also under the impression that by purchasing food at farmers markets, that they are supporting the local economy. As consumers have become more and more concerned about where their food comes from and how it's produced, farmers markets have grown and become more popular. From 1994 to 2006, the number of farmers markets in the U.S. more than doubled, from 1,755 to 4,385. And this rise in popularity is giving the vendors further chances to use deceptive and misleading labels to entice patrons to purchase their products. And so people are motivated to shop at farmers markets for many different factors, depending on their perspective. Some are more concerned about health and environmental concerns. Others are looking to avoid pesticides and hormones. Other people believe that by shopping at farmers markets, they will be purchasing fresh quality produce, and that is a good moral choice, because they are supporting the local economy and likely an organic grower who are perceived to be better than an industrial farmer. Some studies have found that food purchasing behavior is moving from organic to local as organic food has become more commercialized and industrialized. A respondent from a U.S. case study said that they would much rather be able to give their money straight to a farmer than for middlemen who are taking their cut. And so consumers believe that the food and products they purchase at the farmers market are fresh, local, seasonal, tastier, and healthier than food they purchase at the grocery store, and they're supporting the local economy. So we just want to cover the local farmers markets, which I'm sure most of you already know about. There's three main farmers markets in the Kitchener-Waterloo area: St. Jacobs, Kitchener, and Cambridge. So both Kitchener and Cambridge are publicly owned, they're owned by the city, and St. Jacobs is privately owned, and is also the largest of the three and Canada's largest year-round market. And so Kitchener is a little bit smaller, which Cambridge is actually the longest running. It started around the 1830s, and is the smallest of the three. So all three markets sell very similar goods: meat, baked goods, cheeses, maple syrup, eggs, honey, some ethnic foods, homemade crafts, and of course fruits and vegetables. However, the only vendor who has any requirements for where their food comes from is Cambridge, who says that all vendors must come from within a 100-kilometer radius of the market, whereas St. Jacobs and Kitchener have no requirements.
Okay. So the methodology that we use consisted of three main components, the first being the pre-field component. In this component, we developed a preliminary literature review in order to identify a knowledge gap and form our research questions. We developed our survey and interview questions for use at the markets to meet our data needs on consumer perceptions and also market policies. And we identified and contacted three target markets previously mentioned, and with varying results on responses to emails and phone calls, it resulted in us being permitted to survey and interview at the Kitchener market on November 5th. So the field component took place on November 5th at the Kitchener market, where we distributed our survey to market consumers. We did this in a high traffic area at a table set up near one of the entrances to one of the more busy indoor portions of the farmers market. We used convenience sampling techniques to recruit 68 respondents to our survey. And we also conducted an interview with a member of the market management team. This was done in order to establish what identification policies were present at the Kitchener market, if any. So those being the ones that require vendors to identify as a producer or as a wholesaler, and also to gain insights that would complement our survey data. So we would attempt to compare consumer expectations and perceptions with the policies that the market at Kitchener puts in place. And then in the post-field component of our methodology, We analyzed our survey data, determining what data was most useful to us and eliminating any redundancies that we didn't need in the survey data. And we also analyzed our interview results by contrasting the policies at the Kitchener Market with other management policies present at other farmers markets, gained through the use of secondary sources from those farmers markets. So to go through some of the highlights of the survey data, question 2 posed the question, how frequently do you visit the market? To which 84% of respondents responded weekly. This implies that there is a consistent consumer basis at the Kitchener Market. Question 3 asked, which factors influence your decision to visit the market? This was an open-ended question in which consumers were encouraged to give as many factors that influence their decision as possible. 37% of respondents reported that the local nature of the market influenced them to go there, meaning that there's a clear expectation from consumers that the food offered at the market is of the local variety. Questions 4 through 8 were rate the statement questions, in which 71% strongly agreed or agreed with the statement, I would prefer if vendors at the market were the sole producers of their foods. 74% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed with the statement, it is important for me to know where the food I purchase at the market originates from. 97% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed with the statement, it is important for markets to sell locally grown food. 81% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed with the statement, purchasing directly from producers rather than from wholesale food vendors is important to me. And similarly, 100% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed with the statement, I prefer to buy from vendors who produce their own food. So the key findings in the survey data were that most respondents at the Kitchener Market visit that market weekly. Again, this implies that there is likely a consistent set of consumer values present at the market. The local aspect of farmers markets is a major influence on consumers' decision to visit and a clear motivation for people to visit the Kitchener Market. All in all, consumers at the Kitchener Market value vendors who produce their foods, information about the origin of the foods they purchase, and farmers markets that sell locally grown food. Establishing these values and perceptions was important for contrasting with the policies at the Kitchener Market, which we learned about in our interview process.
Now, to complement our consumer surveys, an informal interview was conducted with a member of the Kitchener management staff. And the interview aimed to examine broad market policies for vendors, including any that may require vendors to identify as producers, or identify where their goods are coming from. The interview itself revolved around 4 central concepts: restrictions on sale based on locality of goods, requirements to present information about origin of goods to consumers, requirements to identify as a producer or a wholesale vendor, and market space organization policies that may divide producers from wholesale vendors. Now, the management member noted that while vendors themselves were generally required to be from the area, the products that they sold were not necessarily required to meet specific locality restrictions. So, for example, an artisan cheese vendor was able to import cheese from Europe and sell it at the market. Also, a few vegetable vendors were able to buy vegetables in bulk in Toronto and then sell them as a wholesale vendor at the Kitchener Market. Vendors at the Kitchener Market were not compelled by any specific market regulations to display information about the origin of their goods to consumers, unless required to do so by legislation. In addition, vendors were also not compelled to display identification to consumers declaring if they were the producers of the goods they sold rather than wholesale vendors. The market management member did note that vendors were able to freely display information voluntarily, including any organic certifications that they may have. The interview also revealed that the Kitchener Market had no plans to organize vendors into categories that would divide producers from wholesale vendors. Now, the relatively lax identification policies at the Kitchener Market can be contrasted with stricter policies observed at markets such as the Byward Market in Ottawa. Now, policies at the Byward Market identify locally grown food from the Ottawa area with the Savour Ottawa logo, which can be seen in the bottom right of that picture. And furthermore, the Byward Market groups vendors based on categories, such as if the vendor is the producer of the goods they sell, and then these categories are openly displayed to consumers. So while management policies at farmers markets are relatively diverse, all farmers markets are required to abide by relevant legislation if applicable to the vendors at the market. Now, in summary, our research found that consumers value vendors who produce their own foods, information about the origin of the foods they produce at farmers markets, and that farmers markets sell locally grown food. Now, our interview and policy review found that market management policies are pretty diverse, and they do not necessarily match the consumer expectations. The results of our study imply that market policies requiring the identification of food origin and of producers can help consumers to better meet their preferences at farmers markets. And with that, we'll conclude that.
Thank you. Discuss the questions.
So you said that in the Kitchener market, they didn't really need to label exactly where the produce came from, like the artisanal cheese or whatever. So do you think the farmers at the farmers market are for or against legislation to like ensure that it's properly labeled? Because if that was the case, they wouldn't really be able to sell the cheese.
Well, in that case, they are under legislation, because that product is coming from outside of Canada, so they fall under labeling requirements. That also falls under if you are pre-packaging goods. There are labeling requirements there. But there is some politics to it, I'm sure, if they were to implement policies. There's an egg vendor who sells farm fresh eggs there, but she's actually a wholesale vendor who just sources eggs. So certainly changing policies, once you have existing policies, I'm sure there'll be some politics to it.
So what are the recommendations for like how to like what? So your research is really awesome. I like your survey. I like surveys. And just wondering what recommendations would you have for the farmers market?
Well, I think one of our main conclusions was that the expectations of consumers can be better matched if these policies are in place to kind of identify where food comes from. Not to say that they need to eliminate those who don't produce their own food, but if you label them as such, there's a better chance that consumers will be able to kind of put these values that they hold into action. And the idea is that that makes a better experience for a consumer if they can fully reflect their values in what they do as a consumer, if that makes sense. No? What?
Oh no, I was like, should they have like a rule saying you have to label your food or?
Yeah, like, so what I'm saying is, if they labeled, producer versus wholesaler, or not, or whatever, wherever the food is sourced from, as long as they label it, I think the consumer experience can be enhanced, is what I'm saying.
And yet, there's no sense from the market managers.
No,
to
and
move in
there's a
that
real
direction.
disconnect because there doesn't seem to be any impetus for them to do that, basically.
Was there any sense? Why not?
I don't know.
Part of market management are also vendors
Yeah,
who
that's also
are
true.
Seriously?
not producers, so
Oh.
that may play into it.
Yeah.
Also, it could be a little bit biased because we only did get the one market
Yeah,
reflected in
we
this.
would have liked to been able to go to St. Jacobs and Cambridge too.
The question back here.
How can I, as a consumer, with others who would like to see kind of this signage, progress this movement? Do you think?
Question.
We certainly advocate for it at the public markets, which are owned by the public sector. A private sector market like St. Jacobs, they're pretty autonomous into what they want to do.
And I mean, I think speaking with the farmers as well and saying, and like you can always ask the vendor, like, oh, like, did you produce this? Where did this come from? And if they see that if they start seeing that there's a demand for that and people start asking about it, then maybe they'll like look at management. I don't know if that would be, if they would speak with management and maybe that would change things. But I mean, that's also just a way to find out where your food's coming from too.
Yeah, because most of them label like from Ontario, but that could still be from the Toronto
Yeah, it
wholesale.
doesn't necessarily mean anything. And there's a sense that it would be almost in a way alienating for those who don't produce their own food, so it adds another complexity to it in that it would be like, not in doing this type of labeling, you're almost putting those who don't produce their own foods at a disadvantage, and I think the farmers market management doesn't want to create that kind of alienation among their vendors. I think that's another issue.
One of the things that I've observed folks are starting to do is those who do produce their own food proudly display that their food is their food, and if they're certified to whatever standard, whether it's organic or local or whatever, they certify that and they put that stuff out there. But there's, the big disconnect is that other than people in this room, most people just walk into a farmer's market and assume that it's a farmer's market and therefore the people grew it. So there's no concept of the amount of reselling that there is. But I have noticed over the last decade that the amount of resellers in Kitchener has come down, and we're starting to see a lot more production. And the benefit you get with that is there are some producers who it might be 70 or 30 or 20% is theirs, and they buy in to round out their booth so that it's economically feasible to be at the market. So sometimes the intention that we have, if we want to get clear on this, puts things into categories that don't really work for farmers who are having to be really, really creative to keep in the game.
And just something to respond to that, I was in Ottawa over Thanksgiving and I was at Byward Market. So we showed the one sign here that said it's a farmer, but they also have they have 3 different signs. There's the farmer, there's the vendor, and then there's farmer and vendor. And it says like 60. It says that 60% of what at least 60% of what they're selling is something that they grew. So that kind of I like that because it kind of balances that out a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it seems to me you've identified an interesting issue around what consumers are looking for, and yet I don't know if you had any comments. I mean, it's unfortunate maybe that you didn't include a question to see whether people were aware, as Jody was pointing out, of the extent of resellers.